So, we're going to be doing the Babylonian Exile, and then if we have time, we're going to move into the lesson on the returns. And so, our international situation when we left last time, Judah was this little kingdom that Babylon has now kind of conquered all around, and they had taken the Jews and deported them. However, actually, let me grab one of the lessons just so I make sure I'm covering the same stuff you guys got. So the condition then in Judea during this time, first, there's just utter devastation. So it's not just Jerusalem that's been destroyed. They've gone through all of Judea and destroyed a large amount of their cities and just burnt things down. Like think, Sherman's path to the sea, where they just left everything in devastation behind them. You have a vast number of the Jews being killed. So yes, there's those that are being taken captive, but there are a number that have been killed. There's within the prophets, you'll come across where it says that during this time, to those that are called to the sword they will go. To those that are called to famine they will go. To those that are called to captivity they will go. And so those are some of the three major things that killed off and depopulated the Jews. The first one, the sword, is those actually fighting against the Babylonians, actually being in battle. When it talks about like famine or plague, that's usually the reference of what's happening during the time of sieges. And so you're locked into a city, you can't get out, and so there's nothing to eat, nothing to drink, and there's disease going rampant among the people. That is typically what's happening during the siege, and then those to captivity. So that's when you see that kind of three-part formula, you're usually hearing a reference to the destruction by Babylon. One other thing that's going to factor in, it's not in any of the notes, but there's different places within the prophecies, and I'm going off the top of my head, or I'd have the actual references for you here. But when you read, for instance, in Matthew 24, that the heavens are shaken and the stars will lose their light and the sun will go dark and the moon will, things like that. You'll read that in the Old Testament in the context of the Assyrians coming and in the context of the Babylonians coming. And the meaning of those is often referring to the fact that when they come and they're burning all of these cities and burning all of these towns, that the sun goes dark and you can't see the stars, and it's like there's all that stuff in the air and such like that. That may be where some of that picture is coming from. So it's not always referring to, within the prophetic literature, it's not always referring to the actual stars out in outer space dimming and the actual sun out in outer space losing light. It's the perspective of those that are going through what is being prophesied that can be referred to with those things, because it's that kind of language is used specifically about the conquest of the Assyrians and specifically about the conquest of the Babylonians. So when Babylon is done, Jerusalem is utterly destroyed. All their major cities are destroyed, and so the now what you see is the poorest of the poor being left in the land. They're able to inhabit what houses are standing and what houses are there. And they work the land a little bit, but as we talked about last week, there's no large-scale farming that's going on, and the land is at rest for 70 years. Some of those who had fled to the neighboring countries, so when Babylon came into this area and defeated Jerusalem, people had fled to Edom and Moab and Ammon, and they now return to Judea. And you're going to see how they kind of factor into the story in just on the next slide. But these nations, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, at this point, Babylon didn't go in and fight and destroy them, but they are all paying tribute to Babylon. And so they would be technically within the Babylonian Empire. And I can't remember if Edom ends up receiving its own judgment with Babylon or not. But when all of this was happening to Judah, Edom may have actually been one of those that helped the Babylonians go against Judah. And this may be the premise for the book of Obadiah. So the book of Obadiah is a prophecy against Edom, and it speaks of Edom rejoicing over the fall of Jerusalem, rejoicing over all those things. So the book of Obadiah may be saying to Edom, yeah, you rejoice when Babylon did this, but you're going to get yours too, that kind of thing. Then the government, when Babylon departs with their armies, they put the government under Gedaliah, and the capital is moved to Mizpah. Anyone remember the history of Mizpah? What's happened at Mizpah? I was asking that question so I had time to drink, but go ahead and see if you can answer too.
I only remember the verse of the meaning of the word Mizpah, which means the word watch between you and me while we are apart from one another.
Okay, and do you remember who it was that said that? Okay. Saul, that's part of the history, but different from what she was referring to. So Mizpah originally was the place that Abraham and Lot separated ways because they had too much possessions, and so they had to go, and Lot chose down in the valley, and Abraham was up in the hills. And that's where the location received its name. When Saul first came to power, Mizpah and Gibeon were the two places that he put his military and guarded, and they were kind of the two capitals at that time that Saul utilized. And then because of that, at various different times, Mizpah had taken on some of the governing and such. And Mizpah, when they fell to the Philistines, they went over to the other side to the Mahanaim, but then they would come back and govern from Mizpah until you had David take fully control. Then Mizpah was not the capital. So Mizpah is now the seat of the government. Gedaliah, who is made the governor, is the son of Ahikam, who had saved Jeremiah's life. So when Jeremiah was in the pit, and he had somebody that went to King Zedekiah and asked to have him taken out because he was about ready to die. So Ahikam did that, and so Gedaliah is his son. So there's a good chance that Jeremiah, having been looked on favorably from the Babylonians for having prophesied their victory, he may have had an ability to recommend to the Babylonians who should be the governor. I'm not saying that did happen, but there's a good chance that could have happened, and so that might be how Gedaliah got in there. Gedaliah is also the grandson of Shaphan, who was the scribe under Josiah. So remember, they found the book of the law, and they had a scribe that was able to read it to Josiah. That was the grandfather of Gedaliah. So that's not said in the actual text where we're told about Gedaliah that I'm aware of. It'll say that he's the son of Ahikam, but you have to kind of connect the two on your own. So Gedaliah is there. He's governing in Judea, and when it comes down to the words Judah and Judea, they're basically the same thing. So I'm sorry if I'm like it's Judah up here and I'm saying Judea. Judea really becomes more of the Latin way of saying Judah, and that's why we're used to saying Judea with the New Testament. So Gedaliah is governor of Judah, but he is assassinated. So Ishmael, he was actually one of those from the royal family. He had been leading some troops during the time of the war with Babylon. He and his troops, however, fled to the Ammonites, and there he befriended the king of Ammon, And so the king of Ammon probably encouraged him to go back and take control of Judea, and then he would have somebody there that was an ally of his. And so when Ishmael comes back, he feigns to be a friend, feigns to be acting in good faith. Gedaliah believes him, even though people have warned him, hey, he's out to kill you. And he was told that specifically. He didn't listen to them. And so Ishmael succeeds, and he kills Gedaliah. He also kills some of the Babylonian officials that are with him, as well as other Jews. And then there's also another group of Jews that were traveling through that area of about like 50. And if I remember right from the story, Ishmael and his men come upon them, and they were about to kill them, but the men are like, hey, we know where there's a lot of money buried. We can give you a lot of money. And so they ended up taking the money and killing them anyways. So it shows you, the wickedness of them. So the people fear that Babylon's going to come and take out the remainder of what's there, because they have killed the governor that the Babylonians appointed. So they go to Jeremiah and they seek Jeremiah's advice. And as we talked about last week, they seek that advice, promising, we'll follow it, we promise. And then he gives them the advice, which is stay here and don't run. And part of that was, if you run, you look guilty. So just stay here, you had no part in it. And so they did not listen to Jeremiah's counsel, and they instead decide to flee to Egypt. And so they flee to Egypt, and they first go to Tahpanhes. When they get to Tahpanhes, you'll read in Jeremiah that he actually buries I don't remember if it's like a scroll or a tablet, but he buries it at the very gates of the city, and basically says the king of Babylon is going to sit right here when you guys realize how wrong you were to come here. He's going to be sitting here, and he's going to judge you guys for having fled, and he will kill you here, which then ends up being fulfilled. Now, we don't know if it is at this time or an earlier time or a later time, but there's also a group of Jews who make their way down the Nile to Elephantine, which is an island in the Nile, and we talked about that before as well, where they establish a Jewish colony there, and they actually build a temple there on that island. None of those that fled to Egypt made it back and never went back into the land. So by that time, so imagine what poor there were there, what people were dwelling in the land that were able to have what is there, because the assassination of the governor, even they run and scatter and do not come back. So the land of Judea is completely depopulated at this point. It would be very, very few people living there for the 70 years. So the Jews that were exiled, they were taken to Babylon. And when they came to Babylon, they're given this land that is here between these two rivers. The Chabar River, we think, was a tributary that cut across here. Then you have the main Euphrates River. And the land that they're given is actually choice land. It's great farming land. With the river right there, they're able to use irrigation ditches and such to grow their food. And they live quite well, and this is why many of them never return. A good deal of the Jews remain in Babylon for many, many centuries. So in Babylon, they have different institutions that are maintained. There's still elders of the people that are kind of ruling them. They have synagogues, and they stay together as a people group. Now, one of the differences between their captivity in Babylon and Israel's dispersion to the northern lands is that when Israel was dispersed by Assyria, they were intentionally separated from other Israelites. so that it was hard to build a community of other Israelites. When the Jews went to Babylon, they stayed together as a nation. So all the Jews were in one area and living together, and it was much easier to maintain their culture and maintain their traditions. Still, some of the Israelites that were scattered more broadly, they still did hold those. They still did stay true to those traditions. And that's why we'll see in the return, there are still some Israelites that go back, but primarily it is the tribe of Judah and those that were considered Jews for having lived in Judah that do the return from this area of Babylon. While they're there, they also have priests and prophets being mentioned in letters like Jeremiah's letter. So there's still a priestly class that is still functioning so as to probably teach them in the law, like the Levites were put in the cities to teach the law and things like that. And so you do have a priestly class that is there, even though there's no temple for them to serve in. You also have freedom of movement. So when they're there in Babylon, they are free to travel back and forth. They are not kept in chains. They are not enslaved. They are living in their own homes that they own themselves. And when you're reading the history, you'll see that Babylon comes when they're trying to get them to surrender and says, come out. We'll give you the choices to land. We'll do these things like that. Now, one of the main reasons they get some of the best land is likely the fact that Daniel was already in power by the time the bulk of the Jews arrived in Babylon. They also exercised correspondence privileges, so they were able to write letters and send messages back and forth. In fact, Ezekiel is letters going back and forth between, portions of it are letters that are being sent back and forth between the Promised Land and Ezekiel in captivity. If you looked at this chart here that has the timeline, you would notice that Nebuchadnezzar, it's in 597 that he takes Jehoiachin. It was 605 that he took Daniel, and it's not until 586. So 605, 586, that's 19 years. So there's 19 years between Daniel being taken captive and all of the Jews arriving in Babylon. This makes it interesting when it comes down to determining the 70 years. When does the 70 years start for the captivity, and when does it end for the captivity? And it actually works out somewhat well both ways. If you start with the very first deportation, then the very first return, I think, is like 70 years. But you could also go from the destruction of the temple in 586 to the very first, when the temple is first rebuilt at 70 years. So you can actually go from either one and you still get the 70 years. But since it talks about the 70 years being given the rest and the centralization of the temple, I lean more towards the time of the temple being destroyed to the time of the temple being rebuilt as the technical 70 years, because it was not getting rest in those 19 years between those first ones. So they have freedom of movement, the letters going back and forth. Ezekiel, like I said, he's prophesying before Jerusalem is destroyed, and there's letters going back and forth. Sorry. Man, Judean, you're boring me. You're not good point. You're not teaching. So the Jews, while they're there, they employ themselves in skilled trades. They make money. Actually, many of them become fairly well-to-do. And so it's actually not slavery at all like that of Egypt. And the land that they had was fertile. Now, this is still a punishment. Why is this still a punishment? It sounds like, wow, you almost got to move up. You got moved to a land that was really fertile. You got these houses, stuff like that. Why is it still a punishment?
They're not in their own land. I know.
Yep. They're not in their own land, and how difficult is it for them to go through the loss of their temple being destroyed, Jerusalem being destroyed, and their whole foundation for their faith is shaken to its core. This is partly why you see Daniel and the prophetic messages given to Daniel, where there is this very clear prophesying that shows a control and sovereignty over empires, not just, hey, here's this happening in Israel and stuff like that. But God is saying, yes, they came and they destroyed Jerusalem, but that was completely according to my will. And then let me prophesy and show you how I am sovereign over even empires rising and falling. So you realize the fact that they defeated Jerusalem and destroyed my temple does not mean that they won and that they're better than me. Daniel is structured. Let me go on here to Daniel. Daniel is structured in a particular way to show that sovereignty, which I'll talk about in just a second after we get through Daniel's life. So Daniel and his friends are taken captive. May have been Daniel and his cousins. So from Josephus, we hear that those that were taken captive during this time, and Daniel specifically with the Shadrach, Meshach, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that they were all from the king's family. So that could have been cousins, second cousins, and so on and so forth, but they would have all been within the royal line when they were taken. And so they're taken from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar goes back to Babylon, and when he gets back to Babylon, that's when he becomes king. So when he's in Jerusalem taking captive Daniel and his friends, he's actually prince, and he's a commander of the armed forces, but he is not king yet. When he gets back and he's made king, and he has these wise men of those that he's taken captive, it's kind of like this is his new cabinet in a certain sense, and they're being established in that. And so Daniel is being trained in the ways of the Babylonians, so is Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they are being prepared to be his advisors, and have been taken from the royal family of a place like Jerusalem. They would have been valued advisors because of the education they would have had back home as well. So Daniel, Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah are renamed to Belteshazzar. And it's one of the things we typically as Christians call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We always then refer to Daniel as Daniel. We don't call him Belteshazzar. So I try to stick with their Jewish names. But Daniel is switched to Belteshazzar. Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael is Meshach, and Azariah is Abednego. And so with these names, there's ways that these the names are meaningful, and they're bringing out, especially Daniel's Belteshazzar has to do with honoring Nebuchadnezzar's god, who was Bel. And so just like you have Jehoiakim, and the Jeh comes from Yahweh, the Bel in his name comes from the god Bel. So you can see that that's kind of how the naming is going on. And so these four are trained in Babylonian culture for 3 years. So they basically go to an intense 3-year college. And then when they graduate from that, then they become advisors to the king. So in Daniel's career, he first is exalted to chief prefect over the whole province of Babylon. So the king is king of Babylon, the kingdom and the empire. However, you still have the city of Babylon and a province of Babylon with that. Chief prefect of the province would have been, he'd be like, governor versus mayor. You like the mayor of Babylon city, governor of the province of that, and then you have king of like the whole nation. So this is kind of like he's made governor of the province of Babylon. He is exalted to this position when he interprets the king's dream in Nebuchadnezzar's second year, as king. And so he got back, they were being trained, and then you have this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and he inquires as to, not only do you have to interpret the dream, but you got to give me the dream too. And Daniel is able to do that, and so he gets exalted. He remains in this position even after the Persians take control of Babylon. So Daniel at this time, he gets to this position. He serves this way under almost all of the kings of the Babylonians. And then eventually at the end, when you get Daniel in the lion's den, he's a very old man under the Persian king. We'll talk about who that Persian king was in just a second. But that means he served in this high office for at least 80 years. He was probably about 15 when he is taken to Babylon. So he's about 17, 18 when he's put in that position of being over the province of Babylon. We don't know exactly that, but you look at how old he was and stuff like that. It couldn't have been much more than early 20s when he does this. And it shows you how much it mattered to them, the divine contact with God or with the gods, depending on how you would take it from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, that was highly valued. Something that you see in some of the stories that we're going to look at as we go through the kings and such, there are ways where they definitely listened to prophecies, definitely listened to omens, and there were ways that they would choose positions and award people by here's this puzzle, answer this, and and it may not be the way we would choose people, but hey, that's the way they chose people. So that's Daniel's life. Ezekiel, he's from a priestly family that was taken captive at the same time as Jehoiachin. So that is in the second time that Nebuchadnezzar comes down. So he took Daniel captive in 605. Jehoiachin is taken captive in 597 BC. And in that captivity, you have the king Jehoiachin, you have the king's wives, the queen mother, the king's officials, and the craftsmen and the smiths, the mighty men and the captains, and then Ezekiel is amongst those. So the very first group that was taken had some skilled workers, but then there were people that were supposed to be like cream of the crop of intelligent, and how they went through in Jerusalem and picked who that was, we don't know. But the idea is that they were like the cream of the crop. Then you come back, the second deportation is you're taking a lot more of the craftsmen and the smiths and others that could get the people to gel together and be capable of rebelling. And then the third deportation is when they said all the rest go. So Ezekiel's in that middle one, and he was from a priestly family, and he's taken captive 8 to 9 years after Daniel and 10 to 12 years before the fall of Jerusalem. His prophecies are really emphasizing that God meant this to happen. God is intending for the Babylonian captivity, and why is that happening? It's happening because of the sin of Judah and what they did, and letting them know what is coming. So you have Jeremiah and Ezekiel from Babylon, Jeremiah in Jerusalem, both prophesying at the same time, telling the Jews the same thing. Ezekiel would send these prophecies in the form of a letter, and because they're concurrent, they agree together, Jeremiah and Ezekiel's, and I believe, I'm trying to remember if there's a reference to Jeremiah in Ezekiel. There is a reference to Jeremiah in Daniel. So Daniel, we know, had read Jeremiah's letters indicating the 70 year, and there's a particular place where he begins to pray and say, is this now the 70 years? Is it done? And what's going to happen? And we see that in one of his visions. Ezekiel prophesies the restoration of Jerusalem, and he prophesies this future temple. And the future temple that he prophesies is really it's a difficult. I don't want to call it a theological conundrum, but it's a theological conundrum because he gives a very specific, detailed picture down to what the side buildings are and how large it is and what the dimensions and everything is, and talks about the worship and so on and so forth. And so the question is that temple the one that's rebuilt by Ezra and Nehemiah? Is that temple the one referring to that which was then refurbished and put up by Nebuchadnezzar? Or is this some future temple still yet for us that has not yet been built? There are some ways that it would be similar to what we have with the temple with Nebuchadnezzar. I think one of the biggest arguments I've heard is that the temple of Nebuchadnezzar, or the temple of Ezekiel, the plot of the Temple Mount was almost like either perfectly square or a perfect rectangle, or with Nebuchadnezzar it's a little bit trapezoidal or whatever you want to call it. So there's different things like that. There's other questions that come up. Part of the problem is we don't know much about the temple at all that Ezra built and how that looked, other than it looked pathetic compared to Solomon's, because they wept over it once they were done building it. Nebuchadnezzar's, we know more about it. Josephus describes it in detail, but it's not the same necessarily as Ezekiel's. Part of the issue with just saying, well, hey, it's a future temple, is that there are places that specifically refer to the fact that sacrifices are going to utterly cease and never be done again. And so at that point, how would that factor into it? Is there a rebuilding? And I know there's a lot of different theologies that go with it, but what I say is it's just difficult. It's actually very difficult to figure out because we don't have enough information about the temples that did exist. And it could, going with it's a temple in the future is kind of the easy one, because then you don't got to compare it to anything. You're like, well, we'll just see it when we get there. But that's some of the issues with Ezekiel. But the important thing to realize is he is prophesying another temple. So they know Jerusalem's been destroyed, the temple's been destroyed, or is going to be destroyed. It hasn't even been destroyed yet, and Ezekiel's like, don't worry, there's going to be another temple. And so you have it. And actually that part of his prophecy may have been after it was destroyed, but it's immediately after it's destroyed. And the thing is that the temple is rebuilt. And so it's kind of curious, we'll find out one day exactly what it was referring to. So the prophecies that are being put out by Daniel and by Ezekiel and by Jeremiah are being read and received and better understood by those that have been taken captive to Babylon. So the people that are left in the land that still rebel against Jeremiah, are still against him and all that other stuff, they look at those prophecies, they're disregarding them, and they're actually still arguing for this bad stuff that's happening because we didn't worship the Queen of Heaven, and you see some of that idolatry continuing, so on and so forth. What seems to have happened is in Babylon, when the Jews were taken captive, it worked. Like they were zealous against the idolatry, and they realized that they had sinned. There was a greater sense of repentance. And so the Jews that return after being captive are far more godly than those that remained in the land. And it's an interesting commentary on the discipline of God and the effectiveness of that. The other thing that you'll find as we go through the history is that as of the Babylonian captivity, idolatry in its pure form of actually just worshiping another god using a graven image, that's dead amongst the Jews. It does not become revived after the Babylonian captivity. So again, you see the effectiveness of the discipline. And that's why I say, even though that life was good, it clearly was still a discipline. They wanted to have that land, and that land was a big part of their identity in who they were, and it was a discipline to lose that. Looking at who was in charge during this time, I told you I was going to give this back to you, and I got it all wet with my Coke, so I'll get you a new one. And so Nebuchadnezzar is the one that we're most familiar with. He was the most capable of the Neo-Babylonian kings. Neo because meaning new, and there had been a Babylonian Empire back around the time of about Moses, I think it was, between Abraham and Moses. So the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar is really the first one to take on the whole empire, although his father spread a lot of the empire, and he was his father or grandfather was the one who took out Assyria. And so but Nebuchadnezzar comes in. He's one of the most capable of the Neo-Babylonian kings. He had to rebuild Babylon. So when he gets up on the roof in the book of Daniel, it says, "Look at this city which I have built." He's not looking at a city that had actually been built for hundreds of years, because the city of Babylon, as punishment by the Assyrians, had been leveled, and actually some, as you see down here, the last one, the Assyrians dumped the rubble into the Persian Gulf, which was no small thing, because the Persian Gulf was not that close to Babylon, and so he did actually in the time of his rule build up a lot of that city, and so you can see why he would say something like that. So his father had led the fight against Assyria, and he himself, with his military activity, he went into the Levant, the area of Judah, as the crown prince, as we talked about. And in subsequent campaigns, he gained control of Levant, which his dad did not. And then he eventually gets him to the point where he beats Egypt, and Egypt becomes an ally, and that's why Egypt is often portrayed as being within the Babylonian Empire as well. Tyre was besieged after Jerusalem fell, and the siege lasted 13 years. Anybody remember from history how long Alexander the Great's siege of Tyre was? Like 6 months to a year. And it was just, they went about it very differently, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit if we get to Alexander today. So his empire to the northeast, as we talked about before, was the Medes and the Persians. And it was more treaties with them, and the fact that they were paying him tribute than necessarily he had conquered all of that. So he reconstructed Babylon. It had been destroyed, as we said. And then one of the big questions is, were the Hanging Gardens in Babylon or not? How many of you guys have looked into this at all or ever seen anything on it? Okay, so of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, one of them was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The thing is that we're told about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon by later Greek authors who are hundreds of years later. And so we don't see anything in Nebuchadnezzar's or the Bible's portrayal of Nebuchadnezzar that suggests the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And so some have suggested that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were actually the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh, or somewhere in Assyria with one of the Assyrian kings at a different time, and that they just mistook the cities and so on and so forth. So that might be the case. But if they were in Babylon, what was said by those Greek historians was that he had a wife from Media, which, remember, we talked about the marriages for making treaties. He would have made a treaty with the Medes and the Persians by marrying one of the princesses. And then to please her, he builds this mountain-like, because she came from up in the mountains, so he builds this mountain-like thing in the middle of Babylon with all these trees in order to make her feel more at home or miss home less. Now, think of this as when Solomon ends up marrying the princess of Egypt, and she comes, and he has to build her this really nice. That's like part of the treaty. Usually, is like, you gotta, you're being signed off, but you got to take good care of our girl, and so you could see something like this happening. The other thing is that Nineveh is more up towards the mountains as it is. So, but Babylon is in this flat plain. So it would make more sense to me with Babylon than necessarily Nineveh. But just know that that's out there. But if the Hanging Gardens were there in Babylon, that goes to show some of the great feats of construction that were accomplished there. This is some of the better artwork that I've seen. The lower part, these are actuals. This is actual bricks from the gates of the city of Babylon at the time of Daniel and them being there. You can see how colorful they are. A lot of times when you see portrayals of the ancient world, it's all monotone. It would not have been monotone. It would have been very colorful. They did know how to color their bricks and such. Golden lions were a very powerful and strong motif and consistent there, which may be why in Daniel's vision, Babylon was portrayed as a lion that was then raised up on two legs and its wings torn off, kind of thing. Here, what you see is that the Euphrates River went right through the middle of Babylon, and most likely along the river. I don't know if they would have had major walls along the river like that per se, but they would have had places here where you would have ports and people could stop and you could unload boats and so on and so forth. But that's going to play into how one of the ways that it was claimed that Babylon was taken. If the Hanging Gardens were there, it may have been with this ziggurat, which was either that or a temple. We don't always know what the different things were. This here is a portrayal of the Ishtar Gate. And Ishtar was the goddess of fertility. There's debate as to whether that has to do with our word Easter, because there's also the German goddess of fertility that's Oster. So there's people who go back and forth on those. But the thing about the Ishtar Gate is that we actually can see it today. As you're going to see in just, I'll go to the, that's the Ishtar Gate in real life in Germany. You got to go to Germany today to see the Ishtar Gate, thanks to the Nazis who felt that everything that was archaeological belonged to them. But this would have been kind of where it would be. This is a modern aerial photograph with the overlay of how the outline of Babylon would have been. But you see that rectangle and then the walls around it. It was a threefold wall that was massive. Would have been very, very difficult to conquer prior to cannons. This gives you another picture. So this, because the Ishtar Gate you see in Germany is only the first level. There was a second level. So this would have been somewhat to the effect of what the Jews would have seen walking into Babylon. And Daniel would have for sure seen that. So, after Nebuchadnezzar, you then have Amel Marduk, sometimes called Evil Marduk, which is, you'll pick that up in Scripture. And evil is not, that's a transliteration of the Hebrew. It's not the word evil in English. And then he reigned from 562 to 560 BC, the actual son of Nebuchadnezzar. And he is the one who releases Jehoiachin from captivity, and who was imprisoned, and seats him at his own table and lets him eat from his own food, and basically has him as an advisor kind of thing. And again, when that's happening, when this release is happening, Daniel would have been advisor to the king for a long time, and probably would still be advisor, and may have played a role in Jehoiachin being released. So Amel Marduk ends up being murdered by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. And Neriglissar, who might be the Nergal-Shar-Usur, who might be the Nergal-Sharezer from Jeremiah 39, 11 through 14. So he's one of the commanders that came down to Jerusalem when it's being destroyed, and is mentioned by Jeremiah, because he's the one that locates Jeremiah, releases him from prison, because Jeremiah was imprisoned to keep from prophesying the fall of Jerusalem. So he releases him and tells Jeremiah, you can live wherever you want. So that's who Nergal-Sharezer is, and he very well may be Neriglissar, which is this man who assassinates Amel Marduk and then takes on the rule. So he sought to expand the empire across the Taurus Mountains. So that is a very tall mountain range that is right here in Turkey. There is basically one pass through these mountains called the Silicean Gates. And unless you can capture that pass, you're in trouble. And because of that, anytime you have to take an army through the mountains and you've got one way to go through it, so the rest of the armies know exactly where you're coming out, that's a very difficult thing to do. And so he was not successful in passing through the Taurus Mountains. In the future, what ends up happening is they end up conquering more through here and then take control of the mountains, and then they're able to go through them fine. But that was not the Babylonians. That ends up being the Medes and the Persians that do that. So it says he was successful at first, was not able to finish. So he returns in defeat, dies shortly after returning, and is succeeded by his son Amel Marduk. And he is assassinated quite shortly by his courtiers. And then Nabonidus, one of those courtiers, actually takes the throne. So Nabonidus, he comes on as king, and he's the son of an Aramean nobleman from Haran. So Arameans, you remember the Arameans from Syria and Damascus, but that people group of the Arameans went all the way up through, up into, let's go here. The Arameans and Damascus were here, but this whole area here is all Arameans, all of that. And is a very large language group, which is why you have the Jews eventually speaking Aramaic instead of Hebrew in the New Testament. And so, but anyways, he was an Aramean nobleman from Haran. You guys remember what's happened at Haran? Where do we have Haran in the past? Again, so I can drink my soda.
Abraham's father died there.
Yep, Abraham's father died there, and his brother stayed there. And this is where Isaac and Jacob both get their wives from. And so there's still a direct relation to those that were there in Haran. And one of the reasons that it's thought that Abraham stopped there was because Haran was a center of worship for the moon goddess Sin, who Jewish tradition has that Abraham's father worshiped that. And here, thousands of years later, it's still one of those centers for that moon goddess. And so Nabonidus, being a worshiper of this, he ends up doing all of his devotion to this moon goddess Sin, and does not worship Marduk. One of the biggest ways of that was that in the New Year celebration in Babylon, what was supposed to happen was the king was supposed to go and surrender his crown to the priests of Marduk and go through this humiliation. Like, I think it was like you were slapped across the face or something like that, where you had to humble yourself before Marduk, and then you would receive the crown back. And Nabonidus was like, yeah, no thanks, and didn't do it, which upset all of the religious people in Babylon and turned them against Nabonidus. He also decided to move to Timah, which I don't think I had it here, but Timah would be down here on the Arabian Peninsula. So he moves to Timah, which was another center for this moon goddess Sin for worship, and he leaves the kingdom in the hands of his son Belshazzar. Now we read of Belshazzar in the book of Daniel. Anybody remember which story in Daniel is Belshazzar? Come on, you can see the handwriting on the wall. All right, that was set up a little bit, but so the story of the handwriting on the wall is with Belshazzar. Now Belshazzar is said to be like a son of Nebuchadnezzar, and you're like, wait a minute, no, he's not. But that's because as kings took on within an empire, there was a way in which they would always point to the prior king as their father, either adopted and such like that. And that's where adoption even was a bigger thing in the ancient world. But he would have seen himself as, and referred to Nebuchadnezzar as father because he had become king under him. The queen mother at that time very well may have been the wife of Nabonidus, or it could have been the wife of even one of the other kings just before this. And it may be that she could have been the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar through one of his later wives and stuff like that. And so they would be considered, they would marry into it. So that's some of the ways that it could be that Belshazzar was actually seen and understood to be a son of Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar, it's telling in that story because when he sees the handwriting on the wall, and he offers for anyone who can interpret it and tell him what it means, that he will be what place in the kingdom? What? He doesn't say second. He says third.
Oh, third.
You shall be third in the kingdom. Why? Because he's only second in the kingdom. So that's part of what is telling that this Belshazzar is during that time with Nabonidus. And so what's happening when the story with Belshazzar is being given is it's actually right before Babylon falls to the Medes and the Persians. Nabonidus has actually come back to the area, but he is in a different city, not in Babylon. Most likely Belshazzar has been left in Babylon to defend it, and he decides to hold this feast, and he pulls out all of these articles of the temple from Jerusalem and uses them in the feast. Now, why is he doing this? And this is kind of a neat thing in a certain sense. Of all the kingdoms that they defeated, why Jerusalem? Why would that be the one he'd pull out on that night? Well, the Assyrians, the great Assyrian Empire, they went and they threatened Jerusalem, and half their army woke up dead. It shows you the fact that Belshazzar is using those articles, that there was a famousness to God and to Jerusalem, and to they have this God that protects them. And so when he gets up and he's like, we're getting ready to go to battle against the Persians, but we defeated even the Jewish God in that temple, and so on and so forth, and they drink from those articles to prove that, and then the handwriting goes on the wall, many, many tekel parson, you've been measured and found wanting. And what's interesting is when, at this point, Daniel's like 80 plus, and he goes, or he's about 80, and he's like, oh, you can have a third of the kingdom. He's like, you can keep your kingdom. I really don't care what you're offering me. Here's what it means. And in reality, there was no keeping, you can offer a third of the kingdom's not going to be yours tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And so it was right after that the defeat of the Babylonians at the hand of the Persians and the Medes occurred. And so that's what's going on in that night when he has that, which makes Nabonidus, together with Belshazzar, the last of the Babylonian kings. Now, the one who is leading the fight against Babylon at this point is Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great was the king of Persia under Media, which was being ruled by his grandfather. And he ends up first taking over Media, and then he ends up going over and conquering Lydia, and succeeds in going through the Taurus Mountains, but a lot of that was because they had already captured it in other ways. And then when they go through there, they succeed in capturing Lydia. Then they turn on Babylon. But while I say this, because while these, the Babylonian Empire is going on, and you've got Daniel and those waning years, during that same time, the Medo-Persian Empire is already an empire. It's not like it becomes an empire after the Babylonians. And that just is interesting to see in the sense of the four beasts that come up in Daniel, because really it's like shortly thereafter, Greece is already coming on the scene, and basically the Jews would have been able to see pretty soon after Daniel's prophesying how true this was and that it was happening, which would have built their faith back up fairly strongly. So how did Babylon fall to Cyrus? So we have a couple of accounts. The fall is not in Scripture, but some of the historians that we have, Berosus, he records that Cyrus defeats the Babylonian army at Opis, and I forgot to change the shadows on here. This is Opis, this is Babylon, this is Borsippa, and you should be able to see that in your notes. But so they first come out and they fight with the major Babylonian army at Opis, and then they go to take Babylon. So when you have Daniel with the handwriting on the wall incident, the army has probably already been defeated at Opis and is now on its way to take Babylon when that story is happening. So in one sense, the Babylonian army is already defeated, doubling how ridiculous the "you'll be third in the kingdom" thing was. And probably why he didn't care saying it, whether his dad was there or not, because it wasn't going to matter. Now, Herodotus and Xenophon, too, the Greek historians that we have, says that Cyrus defeated the Babylonians outside of the city and then laid siege to Babylon, eventually diverting the Euphrates River so his soldiers could walk under the walls using the riverbed. So that's how they record the conquest of Babylon happening. Cyrus himself records it on his cylinder, saying that the people of Babylon opened the gates and let him in as a liberator. So the question is, like, which one of these happened? Well, we do know it's quite likely that at one point, at least, the people of Babylon did open up the gates to Cyrus and let him in as a liberator, because he walked right in. And as the story goes, he went straight to the statue of Marduk and honored Marduk, and went through the whole process and submitted himself to them. And then the people rejoiced with that. And it's actually quite likely that something like that may have happened. Now, that doesn't mean that there was none of these other things happened. When they defeated him outside of the city, when they were defeated outside the city, that could have been the Opis and was talking about. They're on their way, and they're, in order to prepare for Babylon to be defeated, they take their army upriver, divert the river, as the historians say, and you're in Babylon, you see that river being diverted, and you realize they're going to be able to walk in under the walls anyways. And then as that begins to happen, they just open up their gates, and they don't want the city to be razed. So they do. So there's ways that you can kind of blend the three accounts. We don't necessarily have to defend any one of these because they're not scripture. So it doesn't have to do with like inerrancy or anything like that. Where it does factor into is how well would it fit into Daniel's statement that the city was captured that very night. So the idea of the feasting and then the capturing happening that very night. So this is the end of the Babylonian Empire. Daniel, when he had the dreams during the time of Babylon, he first interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the statue with the metals, but then he also has later on the vision of the four beasts. Now, I should have, I remember next week I can do it, but I wish I had brought my slide up that I have that shows the division of Daniel. Actually, let me see if I can find it. Give me just a moment here. It's not a slide, it's a Word document, but I'll bring it up so you can see this. So in Daniel, you guys have heard me occasionally refer to a chiastic structure. You guys remember that at all when I've referenced that in the sermons at all? So the Greek letter chi is an X. It's what the name Christ starts with. but because it has that X where it goes like this, they call it a chiastic structure, where you argue to the middle and then back out again. And so in English literature, we tend to go with introduction, conclusion, and then in either deductive or inductive progress of our points, but we never put our main point right dead center. We either put it at the beginning or put it at the end, depending whether I'm doing inductive or deductive. Well, in ancient world, they would put it at the middle. In the book of Daniel, you have this chiastic structure where you have the statue dream, which corresponds to the vision of the four beasts. You have the three Hebrew children in the fiery furnace, which is almost an identical story to Daniel in the lion's den. And then you have the humbling of Nebuchadnezzar, who then repents and worships God, and then the humbling of Belshazzar, who then turns and is defeated and judged by God. And so, tell him he can wait. No, sorry.
He's not named Norma.
All right. I'm going to tell you. Tell him that you said he's not normal. But I'm just picking on you. So when you see this chiastic structure, you might say, "Well, are you just kind of reading that into it?" But one of the interesting things about Daniel is when you look at the language. Daniel 1 is written in Hebrew. Daniel 8 through 12 is written in Hebrew. But Daniel 2 through 7 is written in Aramaic. That tells you Daniel wanted you to pull those chapters out. Now, part of the reason some people are asking, like, well, what about the additional material to Daniel that was found in the Catholic Bible? One of the reasons why I look at that material and go, yeah, that probably wasn't original, is within the structure of the book, it's out of whack. And it wouldn't, you're squeezing some in here and there, and then it gets out, and none of it's in Hebrew, all of it's in Greek. We don't have any Hebrew versions of that material at all. And then here you see Daniel using the two languages. So that's part of the reason why I'm pretty confident those things aren't part of the actual book of Daniel. But here, this definitely shows you this. Now, when you look at this chiasm and you see these points, what is one of the really powerful pushes and themes that you see that runs through all three of these things?
Maybe God's sovereignty?
You got it. God is able, with the statue dream and the four beasts, God is the one making empires rise and fall. Three Hebrew children in Daniel lion's den. God can protect those who are his and keep them. And he is more powerful than the other gods and even powerful kings. The humbling of Nebuchadnezzar, the humbling of Belshazzar, whether they repented or didn't, God is actually over those kings. So even secular kings and secular rulers, they are subject to him. So it shows his sovereignty in this structure of that. And so it is a really interesting thing to see how Daniel intentionally seemed to have crafted it that way. And especially since this more obvious break would have been 1 through 6 being in Aramaic because it's in the court of the kings, and then 7 through 12 being in Hebrew because it's these prophecies. And so, I mean, that's what you would have expected. And so it's one of the really amazing things or interesting things about the book of Daniel. So, but these two here, the statue dream and the vision of the four beasts, predicts what is about to come up then. Let me get back to my PowerPoint. So you at first had the Babylonian Empire, which is the lion with the wings. When it is stood up on its hind legs and given the mind of a man and the wings are torn off, my understanding of that is it's given the mind of a man because Nebuchadnezzar repented. It's speaking of Nebuchadnezzar himself, who, it's in essence, you were, this beast, but you are exalted to be, like a child of God kind of thing. I think it's going to be awesome if it ends up that Nebuchadnezzar's in heaven and we get to talk to him. That'd be really cool. But Then, after the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians came in, and this was the greatest extent of their empire. And then they are the bear. The bear is seen as one side being higher than the other, and it has 3 ribs in its mouth. And the one side is higher than the other because the Medes was the larger kingdom and the Persians was the smaller one. Or it could be just that it's a dual kingdom and one of them's ruling and the other one is kind of subjected to it. But the 3 ribs in its mouth could be Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt as the 3 large things that had not been conquered before. And so that's what you would see in its mouth. Then the next empire is going to be the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And he is seen as the leopard. And the leopard has the 4 wings and the 4 heads. And it moves with great speed because Alexander conquered the entire Persian Empire in a matter of like 1 or 2 years. And just, it was extremely rapid. And then when the 4 heads and the 4 wings, it was like the 4 generals that carried him, but also the 4 heads because the kingdom gets broken up into 4 kingdoms. And then the final one is the beast that is indescribable. And it's interesting and important to note that the first, second, and third beast can be described with an animal we know. The 4th beast cannot. It's different. Now, the 4th beast is understood typically as Rome. Rome comes in and it's this beast that has claws of iron and teeth of bronze or vice versa or something to that effect. Well, when it mentions that metal, now you're thinking back to the statue dream. So the statue dream had the gold head, and then you have the silver chest, and then the bronze midriff, the iron legs, and then the iron and clay, feet and toes. And so when you part of the question is, since Daniel is aware of this chiasm with the language that he's shown that he is, would he have intentionally put those 2 metals into the 4th beast to indicate that it somehow is what we often refer to as the Greco-Roman world? That kind of thing of the 2 metals being part of the teeth and so on and so forth. Is it a different beast entirely that is not comparable to any other beast because it's not just an empire, but it's actually an entire culture taking over things? That's another question that might be asked with that. With the statue dream, a couple of interesting things then to think about. One is the correspondence between the fact that the head is gold and the very next chapter, Nebuchadnezzar's building a statue, but all of gold. So that's almost a in-your-face God. There's not another, I'm going to stay and it's going to be us, period. So there actually is almost a possible rebellion in the building of that gold statue against what he saw in the vision. But then it gets, with the vision of the statue, where it gets more complicated theologically, is the, I don't know, I want to pick on you, but I picked on you too much tonight. So, okay, there you go. So the statue, the complicated part of it is that you have the iron legs, which would be the Roman Empire. Then you have the iron and the clay. And the iron and the clay of the feet and the toes is really kind of where it gets interesting of like what is meant by the iron and the clay. Then you have this mountain that breaks out and rolls down and crushes the statue and or this rock that does that and then grows into this big mountain. And that's where you're going to get people from the different theological perspectives having a different interpretation of what that is. So what's undeniable in almost every theological view is that Babylon Babylon, Medes, Persians, Greeks, Romans fulfill the 4 beasts and the 4 metals. How all that wraps up is where everybody starts to get different ideas. And so there are some that would say, for instance, I've heard growing up, you guys may have heard different ones, that the 10 toes are like the 10 kings of one of the beasts in Revelation, and that part of the statue is still future. I've heard some interpretations where it's the iron and the clay, because the Roman Empire is no longer being purely Roman. They have people from all over that are coming in, and the culture breaks down, and it's weakening, and that's when the church comes in and basically takes over the Roman Empire and grows, and that's the rock coming out of the hill, and so on and so forth. So there's different ways that it's a future. So there's different things. I'm not going to tell you, because I can't tell you with any authority which one it is. It's just as you study, you're going to realize the statue is really solid and the beasts are really solid to a point, and then it gets a lot more difficult to determine what exactly it's talking about. And I had them all separate, I guess. So it's 7:28. I could either take some questions and then we could just do the next lesson next week, or I could start into the next lesson. What's that?
We're not meeting next week, right? It's the week after.
Yeah, it would be the week after. You're right. The week after.
Is your light on all the time up there, Dwayne? Are you recording? Your camera?
Yeah, I should be recording. Oh, yeah, I'm recording. Yep, I got a red light here, which means go, but it's red, so I don't know why.
I thought there was a little light at the top. I could see it.
Got it. All right. Well, how about we just do? How about, because it's I was going to do the second lesson more if we ended like 7:10 or 7:15 ish, but it's 7:30. So how about we go ahead and take some time to have questions? If you guys have questions, and if not, then we can go from there. And as usual, questions about the lesson. Then if you guys have any other questions, you can ask those as well. Yeah, Dave.
Well, in Exodus chapter 4, where Moses is going to go back to Egypt, and the Lord was mad at him, was thinking about killing him, and Zipporah went and circumcised their son. That sort of just come out of the blue and just falls in there, and I'm sitting there. What was the significance of that? I know he hadn't fulfilled the Abrahamic covenant, circumcising his child, but I just couldn't figure out why God all of a sudden was so angry and was thinking about killing him. And yet she knew. Yeah.
I think the circumcising of the sons is a very interesting thing. Other than it's almost to me like the Balaam and the donkey thing. So Balaam was approached to go and curse Israel, and at first he's like, checks with God. God says no. So he's like, no, I can't. But then he still wants to really do it for the money. And so, but he tells the king of Moab, okay, I'll go, but I can only say what the Lord wants me to. And the Lord had kind of told him, you can do that. But then while he's on his way, the Lord having already told him, you can go and do that, but you have to say what I say to you. He seems to have this necessity to put this donkey in the way and almost kill Balaam to get a point across to him. And I feel like it's like Balaam in his heart might even be like, maybe this, maybe that, maybe I'll get there and I'll do this and I'll do that. And he's not, and God's like, no, I want you to know you're going to do this or I'm going to kill you. And he knows that. And so, and so what I mean with the thing with Moses is that as Moses is on his way to Egypt, if there's any way like in his heart where God says, you're not taking this seriously enough. You're not, there should have been, and maybe he expected Moses to be like, hey, I'm getting ready to go back and do this. I need to get right with God and circumcise my family and make everything right and go. But certainly if he almost dies because of that and then he does it, then he realizes, okay, I have to be right before God if I'm going to do this. That's kind of more how I see it, as getting him to take it more seriously. But we're not told, so that's a thing that's open somewhat to our
In his
interpretation.
culture, he didn't realize, because it doesn't say how old this child is. I mean, he's supposed to go in 8 days, right? Isn't that right?
Well, and it was two of them, two of the sons. So one of them's at least a year or so. And 8 days wasn't. I don't know if the 8 days was given until the law. So
It's actually medically that on the 8th day the blood has the highest clotting factor.
wow, imagine God knew that.
What was that again?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the interesting things, with the whole thing of circumcision, just all the way around, is how it became a symbol of something. I mean, of all the things. I mean, imagine like no circumcision at all. And God says, "Okay, here's how I want you to show you everybody you're my people." What? It's kind of like, but yeah, it is an interesting, it's an interesting thing. But yeah, that's my best answer for that is just that there's the not circumcising his kids shows a certain lackadaisicalness about him toward God and feeling he has to be right before God, and then that lesson that God is doing is giving him a seriousness that may have been needed. So.
Good. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah.
Why was the land dormant for 70 years? And if it was, how did the people survive?
So the reason the land was dormant for 70 years is because the Jewish law required a Sabbath year and then a year of Jubilee. And so every 7th year they were to plant nothing. But they were to eat what grew on its own. So just as a small example, you can, if you drive by any of these fields out here that are left for a year to do nothing, you'll actually see some corn growing up and some stuff growing that was left over from the prior year and stuff like that. And so some of what they were being told is God says, I'm going to make so much of that grow that you're going to be able to get by. And so they weren't to prune their trees or things like that. They weren't supposed to prep it and work it, but they were able to go out, pick it, and eat it as they went. And so it was more of you had to trust that God was going to cultivate it. Now they also were told to, similar to like with the Sabbath day, that on those years prior to that, save up, store up, and be ready for it. But they basically ignored that. For all those years of Israel's history, they did not celebrate the Sabbath years or give it the year of Jubilee. So if you go 7 sevens, that's 49, and then that 50th year would have been the year of Jubilee. So that's 7 days of rest plus another one. So eight years per 50 years. And so it was the number of those years that were skipped added up to 70. And so God said that's why the land must be at rest for 70 years. While it was at rest for those 70 years, stuff grew. And for the most part, there were still things there. But you can see through the sovereignty of how everything worked out with them going down into Egypt, there was hardly anybody there to work it, even if you were to work it. And so whatever just grew naturally almost would have been sufficient for the very little population that was there. But there was very little population. It was, when they come back, as we're going to see, Judea, where they return to, is dinky. And there's the few people, and they're building cities from scratch. There was nothing there. And even who was left there, when you got no major cities, no markets, no people to buy your stuff, you move. And so that was a big part of why it was just utterly desolate during that time.
Related to that, it appears that the 7-year Sabbath is not upheld by the Pharisees in the Bible in Christ's day. Is that because the history of the New Testament doesn't cover more than 7 years, and therefore you wouldn't run into that situation? Or have they just ignored it and it wasn't covered anymore?
It definitely was honored after the captivity. And I say that because in a lot of our other histories, so Josephus and the Mishnahs and things like that, and even from other proclamations of the kingdoms that the things that were promised to them, for instance, by the Ptolemaic rulers, the things promised to them by the Seleucid rulers, were like, hey, you come this, you won't have to pay taxes during your Sabbath year. And so there was a constant honoring of that seventh year. And that actually seemed to be something that was taken seriously all the way through the New Testament. And you'll notice that when it comes down to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, there has nothing to do with the land getting rest for the 7 missed Sabbaths or anything. So it seems from the history, because one of the very first things they advocated for when they came under another ruler was no taxes on the 7th year. And they were often granted. In fact, that's why a good deal of the Roman world hated the Jews. The Romans were very strong in their relationship with the Jews, as we'll see in the intertestamental period class that we go through. They actually were allies, and the Romans liked the Jews, and the Jews liked the Romans. The Greeks hated the Romans, and the Syrians and others in the area hated the Jews, because they had special privileges from the Romans, and they were jealous of that. And so it really typically was the other nations that hated the Jews, not the Romans that did.
I just, as we're going through this, it just seems that the Jews are a picture for us as we see that if we follow the Lord, how He will bless us. Mm-hmm. But if we don't, we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
But it just is, it kind of strikes you how awful their life became because they left the Lord.
Yeah. So Sherry was talking about how the Jews are a picture of the, how if we follow the Lord, He blesses us, and if we go away from Him, He curses us. And that's part of seeing the whole Scripture and going back and realizing everything that I have just taught you guys over these last months was completely laid out in Deuteronomy at the beginning. This is going to happen. You're going to go. You're going to get in the land. I'm going to assign a place, but you're going to fall away. You're going to do this. You're going to go after other gods. When you do, I'm going to do this. And this is going to happen. And it goes all the way to the end and says, and then you eventually are going to, you'll return, and then I'll write your spirit on my heart. But then you'll notice that it ends in Deuteronomy with, you will go and try to prostitute yourself to people, and no one will buy you. No one will take you up on it, and you won't be able to do anything, and you are going to be completely rejected. And then it's done. And then you get to the end of 70 AD, and that's pretty much where it's at. So it really is amazing to stop and think that God predicted all of that ahead of time, which means it's all intentional. Intentional in that God allowed it all and guided it all, because it's supposed to tell us about Him. It's supposed to tell us about us. It's supposed to inform us. And that becomes a hermeneutical approach, a way that you approach Scripture, and you're asking, what is this saying to me, in the sense that now it's this completed, story that God intended to teach us and become a picture for us. And that's why I think you see a lot of the New Testament authors pointing back to these things and drawing from them meaning for us, but in a slightly different way. Christ was the rock in the wilderness, and this stood for this, and this was for this, and the author of Hebrews saying that that area of the tabernacle is talking about this age. You're like, where is this coming from? It's because you realize that how intentionally God carried this history out, having predicted it specifically ahead of time. Now, what's really neat about that is when you begin to realize then part of what's predicted back in Deuteronomy involves us. And we're in it. We're there in Deuteronomy, God knowing that it was going to go to other nations and others were going to come. It's amazing to stop and think about that. So, any other questions? All right. Have a great week, and we will see you guys 2 weeks from now.